How are you? Get this over here. Yeah, I saw you had commented. So that works. All right. Got a few more from since Friday, that's for sure. Man, almost into October. All right. We've got some people watching. All right. New week. I haven't even looked. I was just thinking, when's our next exam? 2 weeks, looks like. 3 weeks. 1, 2, 3. 3 weeks. So about 3 weeks. This week we have outside lab. So be prepared to go outside. If you can drive, that'd be great. You can take people with you. If you can take people with you, that's awesome. We're going to meet down in lab, take our quiz, get some instruction, and then head out and mark some grasshoppers. So check the lab handout. Goes over what we're going to do. We'll be out there for about an hour or so, and then we'll be done. So it's not going to take the full 3 hours, but we might not get out there until 3 o'clock when everyone gets there and start sampling. It's not a far drive, and I showed my class where we're going, so it's really not far. It's here local. All right. Questions? Another Monday. You know, it's halfway through the semester this week. And advising started. So if you haven't heard it, advising starts this week. You have to get advised before you can register. I don't think you have to tell you guys that. Tell my freshmen that. They don't believe me. They won't believe me. All right, so we left off here. I said instead of moving forward, we were going to just quickly review C3, C4, and can plants. So we present this. It's not a botany course, but we have to understand why plants occur where they occur, and especially the types of plants. Where do they occur? Why do they occur? Where they occur? And one of the big reasons is tied to water stress. All right, water balance. Plants have that issue where they need gas exchange to take place, but in order for that to take place, they're also going to lose some water through transpiration. So what they try to do is close their stomata, limit the transpiration that occurs, but in doing so, they prevent gas exchange, and that can pose a host of problems. So through our evolutionary time, during diversification of plants, you had the formation of C4 pathways and then CAM pathways. All right. So C3 fixed and assimilated all carbon all in one step, took CO2 and basically got it right into the Calvin cycle. All right. One step. Rubisco catalyzed that reaction. All right. Took that CO2, made it into a 3-carbon molecule, 2 of them. One of them went ahead and was passed on to our energy production stages. The other was used to regenerate our ribulose bisphosphate. All right. Downside of that is Rubisco only has a moderate affinity for CO2. So if the concentrations fell below that binding point, then Rubisco has a possibility of binding oxygen. In response to that is to separate where Rubisco occurs, where that binding of Rubisco to CO2 occurs. C4 separated this in space. So now what they have is these C4 plants take carbon dioxide, take it out of the air, bind it, and create oxaloacetate, which then completely changes right into malate. All right. Pep-C, phosphoenol pyruvate carboxylase, catalyzes that reaction. So we fix our carbon into a 4-carbon molecule, get it into malate, and then malate is our transport. That malate's going to move the CO2 into our bundle sheath cells, where it then releases the CO2 right to Rubisco, so our concentration at Rubisco is always going to be high. That avoids photorespiration in those plants, all right, and it allows our stomata to remain closed while fixing of the CO2 still proceeds. All right, why is that important? It's because regeneration of the phosphoenol pyruvate, PEP, takes energy, costs energy. Regeneration of RUBP costs energy. And the energy is derived from the light reactions. So our plants need the light. During the daytime, they're going to be fixing your CO2. C4 plants separated with the help of this Krantz anatomy that we talked about, where our chloroplasts are concentrated in bundle sheath cells, so they're in separate location, compared to C3 where the chloroplasts are all over. All right. CAM plants represent an extreme conservation measure. All right. Their chloroplasts are scattered throughout the leaves, throughout the stems. All right. But instead of separating in space, they're going to separate it in time. So now we have this very complex regulatory pathway that allows fixation to occur at night when the stomata are open, and then it stores all of this malate, stores it as malic acid in the vacuoles. So your concentration of malic acid continually rises in the evenings, all right, at night. And then when the sun comes up and it starts getting warmer, then we have a switch. Now malic acid gets switched back to malate. Malate gets moved out of the vacuoles, where it then releases its CO2 right to Rubisco. All right, right to Rubisco. And during that time now we're regenerating the RUBP. All right, we're going to regenerate RUBP. So we need all that excess energy. So these plants, they open up their stomata at night when it, in theory, should be cooler. All right, but the cost of this complex regulatory method makes these plants not very efficient. So they're going to exhibit slow growth rates. Their reproductive potential is going to be a lot lower than C3 or C4 plants. All right. Now, why do we have C4, or why don't we have C4 dominating? Well, it's because of these reasons. All right. We talked about the efficiency. I just kind of said the CAM plants are going to be way less efficient than C4 plants, all right, and C3 plants. So, you know, if all things are equal, C3 plants are going to do best. And that's kind of the whole point of it. You know, there's a lot of places here in the world where these plants lived where the C3 plants are going to have that fitness advantage. All right? And if you have that fitness advantage, you are going to do better than everybody else. Second up was the concentration of CO2. All right? The higher the concentration, the higher the atmospheric concentration, the harder it becomes to concentrate that CO2 in the bundle sheath cells itself. All right, really, you kind of think about it and say there's no reason to do that. You have a naturally high level to begin with, so you don't really have that need to kind of separate fixation and assimilation. It wasn't until our atmospheric CO2 levels started to come down, started to approach more modern day levels, when now we had this need to separate the two processes. All right, so historically, during the diversity of the plants, you really didn't need to concentrate it. And then lastly, we can look at optimum temperatures of our enzymes. Rubisco prefers 25 to 30 degrees or so, but it works at the cooler temperatures. And anytime it's below that cooler temperature, anytime it's below 25 degrees Celsius, it really doesn't bind oxygen. So our plants can close the stomata and not worry about consuming excess energy through photorespiration if our temperatures are cooler. Where do we see these temperatures? Where do we see these cooler temperatures? Well, just head north. I mean, look at today, all right? If we trust the daytime high of 76, is that going to be, 25 degrees Celsius? Pull out your calculator, calculate it out. Get on your phone, check the, Celsius to Fahrenheit calculators. You'll see that, we're going to be at that cutoff. All right. So on days like today, even though it might be dry, plants aren't going to be exhibiting that photorespiration. All right. And probably the most important place, though, is in these shaded communities. So think about communities, plant communities, and through succession. So it starts out as a bare piece of land. You have your weeds coming in. You have all your low plants, and then as you get stemmed plants coming in and taller plants, you're casting shade. That shaded area is not only bad for C4 can plants because they need light, they need high light environments, so they don't do so well, but those shaded environments are also cooler. All right, and those shaded environments, if they're cooler, are going to give that fitness edge to the C3 plants. So you've got this suite of things. While our C4 and can plants are efficient at saving water, they have all of these costs, and historically it wasn't going to favor them. All right, questions? All right, too much water can also be a problem. All right, why is that? Well, it comes down to oxygen. The roots take up oxygen. That's their primary source. That is the primary location where oxygen is absorbed. So if you have flooded soils, our plants could become stressed for oxygen. All right. So flooded soils, even though you have dissolved oxygen in the water itself, usually, we refer to them as being anoxic, so no oxygen. How do the plants get around this? There's a couple of adaptations that we have. All right, so first is just straight up biochemical. When the soils get flooded, if it's a regular type of flooding occurrence, so let's say seasonal flooding, perhaps our plants can slow their metabolism, slow the biochemistry, which reduces their oxygen requirement. So this would be a time where maybe if a plant undergoes developmental arrest, then perhaps they do it when the soils flood. That's one type of adaptation. Second types of adaptations are morphological. So you basically develop some structure that allows themselves to absorb oxygen from the air. So there's two types of these adaptations that we can talk about it. Adventitious roots and pneumatophores. These are both roots, all right? Modified roots, you can say. All right. Adventitious roots are produced at or above the soil surface, and then they extend down into the soil. All right, and these roots will absorb the oxygen from the air. So this is a picture of these adventitious roots. Corn plants have it. Go out into a field, you can see them. These adventitious roots. Possibly add a little bit more stability to the plant as well. Because the flooded soil, depending on types of soil, won't provide a whole lot of stability. So maybe these developed as like, two different roles. Perhaps they came about initially as support to help the plant stay upright, when the soils become soggy and saturated. But then also when they when they grew, since they were above the surface of the soil, they absorbed the oxygen, and then those individuals were more fit than everyone else that didn't have these. Kind of easy to think about. Mangrove trees, have a slightly different adaptation. So mangroves live in swamp-type areas. All right. They're basically living in water. All right. They're faced with this problem of getting oxygen. So what they've developed are these things called nematophores. Basically aerial roots. All right. And these are roots that extend up and above the surface of the water. And then when they're above the surface of the water, they are able to take up oxygen. All right. When you go out to mangroves, you'll also see some other things that extend down into the water. Those are not nematophores. The nematophores actually come up. So in the surface of the water, you can see these things sticking up around the tree. Now you know what those are. Those are the roots. Well, I should say specialized roots, but they're there for oxygen uptake. Aquatic plants are a little bit different. All right, we'll leave that for botany. Hopefully botany covers those, right? Any questions? So let's go over the summary. So we had temperature stress, we had water stresses, all right? And we kind of introduced this whole idea of adaptations. This is all physiological adaptations. So our adaptive responses exist. We know that they do, all right? And what adaptation the organism utilizes varies based on the conditions in which they're encountering, all right? Frequency, predictability, all of this stuff, all right? Some of the adaptive responses involve resistant or inactive life stages. Some of those adaptive responses take on movement. All right, just move to a different location. Some of them, the movement is a very strenuous type of movement, is in migration. And other mechanisms allow the organism to change their tolerance limits. Sometimes that is more of a evolutionary shift where selection favors it. Other times it's a gradual change, so the organism basically acclimates to their current environment. Now, all of the adaptations that we look at should be examined in light of the type of variation or the type of the harsh environment that they're encountering. All right, so what is that nature of the variation? That's kind of the idea. What factor is the limiting factor? All right, is it water? Is it temperature? Is it salt? What is it? Is that type of harsh environment, is it constant? So it's always harsh? Or is this more of a variable type of harshness? So maybe today it's harsh, maybe tomorrow it's not, and then Wednesday it becomes not so harsh, and so forth. So is it a constant harshness where it has to figure out how to deal with it immediately and do so for the rest of their life? Or is this a possibility where that harshness could go away? Now, if we have this variability in this limiting factor, is that variation predictable or is it unpredictable? Is it predictable and unpredictable? And these 2 points here, constant, variable, predictable, unpredictable, kind of give us an idea as to what type of response would be best. Would it be best to evolve like a whole new adaptation that allows us to deal with it? Or would it be better if we just took the easy way and moved? Or took like a resting stage approach? All the other things we should consider is this limiting factor interacting with any other factor that's out there? So we talked about water stress. I mean, that's in plants that interacted with the need for carbon uptake, with gas exchange. So we have to take both of those into account to fully understand the adaptation and the evolution of these C4 and CAM plants. And lastly, is this organism mobile or sessile? Could the organism move? And if it can, will it? How can that organism detect the changing conditions and get to that favorable environment before the environment changes drastically. So as we end this, I want you to remember kind of this big take-home idea. All right, we've got this constant and predictable versus variable and unpredictable type of situation. All right, and that's kind of the key to understanding the types of adaptations that we'll see. So you can have two very different organisms evolving in two very different parts of this world, and yet we could see similar responses or similar adaptations because these limiting factors have the same type of nature in terms of their variation. So it could be constant and predictable type of harshness. It could be two separate things. It could be temperature for one and water for the other. But if it's constant and predictable, those organisms may evolve similar type of adaptation, similar type of response. All right? If it's variable and unpredictable, could evolve a similar type of response. All right? And we're going to come back to this idea as we talk about phenotypic plasticity versus genetic changes and so forth. Any questions? All right, you get this? Kind of a big take-home point. All right, so let us move on. Let me open up the correct version. All right, so we introduced the adaptations physiological ecology. Now let's talk about some of the variation that we see all throughout the Earth. Some of this may be review. You may have encountered this at some point throughout your education, and chances are you have seen some of this. All right, what we're going to talk about is what causes the environmental variation that we see out there. So in this first presentation, we're going to focus more on like the big picture and talk about some of the terrestrial variation that's out there. All right. This is, I believe, chapter 4 maybe of your textbook, and you'll see if you go through the chapter, they talk about the different biomes. I'm not going to ask about the biomes. I'm not going to ask you what are the dominant plant types or anything like that. All right. We're going to look at the big picture and then kind of move on. If you're interested in that, feel free to read through it. But what we're gonna deal with is what causes the environmental variation, and specifically what causes spatial variation first. All right, we'll also talk about some of the temporal variation as well. So our environmental variation ultimately determines the species distributions. All right, and this variation is going to vary in space, and that's why we have different species maps. You just look at a range map, you'll see a range map of a species in the United States. It'll follow, a pathway, and if you can figure out what their tolerance limits are, you can figure it kind of start to make sense that, oh yeah, that's why they're there. But that's not the only thing that affects our distributions. All right. We also have to take into account the other biotic and abiotic conditions that are out there. So the biotic conditions in the sense that our organism has to deal with competitors, our organism has to deal with predators and diseases and pathogens and so forth. So it's going to actually be the suite of environmental variation and the biological variation that determines our species distributions. Now, what causes this spatial variation across the landscape? Well, a lot of it's due to discontinuities in our physical and biological factors. It's going to be due to changes in our weathering events, changes in moisture content. It's going to be changes in wind pattern and so forth. And that's what we're going to be looking at. So just kind of as an overview, I looked at Google Maps, the satellite images. I don't know if you spend time. Sometimes I can get lost looking at satellite images, zooming in, zooming out, and say, oh, that's cool. Then you get to that spot where it's like a big blue box and there's nothing there, and then you can go down that conspiracy theory thing and say, oh, the government's hiding something. Maybe that's where the aliens are kept. All right, but in this zone, what I did is went to White Sands National Park, Lincoln National Forest. I was going to do it around here, around San Angelo, but I mean, we have civilization, cities and stuff. Kind of takes out of a lot of the variation. But here we have Lincoln National Forest, New Mexico. You've got your White Sands National Park. You can see the range of variation just from the satellite imagery. You can see your vegetation. There's a lot of vegetation here, all right? But that's only on one side, right? We go to this side, now they really don't have a whole lot of vegetation. That's just going to be bare ground, bare rock. And then you've got, the White Sands out there. It's a lot of variation. And all of that is just due to discontinuities, geologic and in some cases, climatic variation. So where does this environmental variation? Well, our abiotic factors determines our geographic range, all right? So the geographic range is the region in which a particular species is found, or a region in which a particular species can be found. And what we're going to do is kind of separate it later on between a potential range and an actual range. This range is basically determined by the abiotic factors. And for here I said, recall the law of tolerance, all right, because that's what we're dealing with. So the law of tolerance is going to determine basically our potential range. And then the biological factors kind of tell us more about the actual range. All right, so you kind of start broad, and then once we look at the biological factors, then it's going to narrow down a bit. This is a process called ecological filtering, and that's near the end of this presentation where we kind of get to that. So our climate is a key component of our physical environment and is a key driver of all of these abiotic factors. The big ones are temperature and precipitation. And this is where I think you've probably seen this talk before. So what causes difference in temperatures? What causes difference in precipitation at a large landscape level? Leave that up. So we're going to talk about temperature first, and we're going to talk about precipitation. And I just have these graphs here to kind of show difference between tropical forest and desert, and that kind of links back to our ranges. What a species in a tropical forest encounters is very different from what they would encounter in a desert-like environment. All right? So temperature. Temperature is largely determined by the amount of solar radiation that we receive. All right? And that amount of solar radiation that we receive depends on where we are on the Earth and what time of year. All right? So the angles of sunlight that are going to hit the Earth kind of informs us about the amount of solar radiation. So this is pretty easy to see, pretty easy to experiment with. All right, you just go, stick a hand flat right to the Earth, or right to the sun. You get a lot of heat, big surface area. All right, that is effectively at the equator. Most of the solar radiation hits there. It's at a 90-degree angle. It's going to be hot. It's going to be warm in that region. As we progress increasing latitude, all right, that angle of the sun starts to become more acute. That means that the solar rays, had to travel a longer distance to get there. They've lost some of their energy. So by the time it hits the Earth, you still have UV light hitting it, but it has less energy that it's going to contribute to warm up that part of the Earth. All right, so equator's hot, polar regions are cold, all due to differences in the angle of the sunlight. altitude also plays a role. I don't know why I say latitudinal variation driven by altitude. I think what I meant to say is that latitudinal variation and altitude show the same types of trends in terms of our variation. So, if we progress up in latitude, we get cooler. If we go up in altitude, we get cooler. And the reason why we get cooler in the altitude, so even though we're getting closer to the sun and we should have more intense solar radiation at that point, and we do, you'll burn a whole lot faster the higher up you are. All right. The cooling process is due to this adiabatic cooling, which is decreases in air temperature due to pressure. So those of you that are in chemistry or have chemistry, perhaps you remember the ideal gas law. Right? What is the ideal gas law? Who's in chemistry? Weston, were you struggling to remember that? PV over T, right? Pressure times volume over temperature. All right, so pressure drops. If pressure drops or temperature drops, that's adiabatic cooling or adiabatic cooling. So as we go up in altitude, the air pressure drops. All right, as the air pressure drops, there's less energy in those molecules because molecules are spread out. And that's also ideal gas law. PV equals nRT, right? So you get cooling. How much cooling? It varies. It varies. On average, it's about 6.5 degrees Celsius per 1,000 feet of elevation. All right. What's our elevation here in San Angelo? Anybody? Take a guess. Let's start at a number. Take a guess. 3,000? All right, so there's our starting point, 3,000. Do you think we're higher or lower than that? Lower. How much lower? Give a new number. 2,000? All right. Does anyone think we're higher than that or lower than that? It's like a Price is Right game. That's it. That guy that climbs up the mountain, high, right? Which one was that? I'm probably dating myself, right? Yeah. I had a 9 o'clock class and then an 11 o'clock class my freshman year. What did I do at 10 o'clock? Came back to my room and watched Price is Right. It's close. Lower. Yes. Hope Jensen says lower. Yeah, it's a little bit lower. We're about 1,800 here. All right, just slightly lower than 2,000. So in theory, all right, we're almost 2,000. It could be, geez, man. Can you imagine this? Could be 12 degrees, 13 degrees hotter. Does it make sense? Well, think about Death Valley. Think about Death Valley. All right, that's hot. All right, some of that is due to altitude. It's lower than every place else. Not only due to that, but so altitudinal variation in temperature exhibits the same type of pattern as latitude. Higher up you go, the cooler you go. Seasonal variation is determined by the Earth's orbit. All right, and again, it's linked to the amount of solar radiation that we receive. All right, so as the Earth orbits the sun, all right, you have that change in where that 90 degrees comes from. All right, and it shifts basically between two lines on our globe. What are those two lines? Centered at the equator. What is our 30-degree lines? Man, it's going back, right? Tropic of Cancer and Capricorn. All right, that's basically where it's going to fluctuate. All right, that's why that's the tropical region. All right, it's tropics there. All right, what it's also considering is day length too, and that's something that kind of gets missed. All right, so at the equator, our day length is pretty similar year round. All right, it's pretty similar year round because we're just constantly, this 90 degrees is just constantly hitting the equator. very little change. But as we go to the poles, we can have pretty drastic change in day length. So just think about Alaska, the far north. You've got some days where the sun never comes up, complete darkness. So those regions, they don't get any sort of solar radiation to warm themselves up. They are just constantly cold and freezing. And then in other parts of the year, it is basically in 24 hours of daylight. Right? We have some variation in our day lengths. Right? That's why we get seasonal temperature changes in temperature. All right, but it's not as extreme as going farther north. I grew up outside of Chicago. During the summer, regularly 9 o'clock at night, you still had some daylight out. And it's not a huge difference until, didn't really, I noticed it, but it wasn't magnified until I visited Alberta, Canada. And then it was 10 o'clock at night and it was still daylight. Just crazy, crazy. You're up at 5 o'clock and it's daylight. So day length at the equator, similar year-round. Day length at the poles, it's going to be highly variable. Again, it's the range that we're talking about. The range of temperatures are going to be much bigger at the poles than at the equator, and that's our organisms have to deal with that range. What about bodies of water? Yep. Where we are in relation to a large body of water can also affect our temperature. We can say water acts as a modulator, as a moderator. It can act to kind of stabilize some of these changes. So maritime climates are going to be those climates that are close to a large body of water. And what we see is that our range of temperatures that we experience, the variation in our temperature, is going to be pretty low. And we'll still see it, difference between daytime and nighttime. We'll still see that change, but it's not going to be a huge change. It's not going to be a drastic change. Right? These places, you can think about, where would I encounter this maritime climate? Well, go out to California, Southern California. All right? It's like the picture of, guys out on the beach surfing year-round. It's maritime climate. You're not going to see this huge change in temperatures. Contrast that with what we experience here. We have a continental climate. We don't have any large body of water modulating our climate, so what we can do, what we see is a very large temperature change, very large temperature swing. And the swings that I'm talking about are the daily swings. So as we go into winter, it's not going to be uncommon for us to hit 70 degrees during the day and then down in the low 30s at night. In some cases, it's like a 50-degree temperature swing between night and day. That's typical of a continental climate. So a climate that's far from our large bodies of water. All right. Questions? All right, I think we're going to stop here. I know I'm ahead. But what we'll do is we'll pick up precipitation on Wednesday. So it gives us kind of a stopping place. I will have you consider the Earth's rotation as well. All right, because when we think about wind and what causes wind, it's going to be due to our rotation. So you've got a mixture of heating, the solar energy heating up our air, and then the air being moved around because the Earth is spinning. All right, and we're going to set up variation in our weather patterns as well as precipitation patterns. All right, we'll be done today.